Okay, so welcome to those of you who have joined us specifically for the conversation and lecture with and by Craig Murray. Otherwise, we are continuing our events today. The conference Reading the Word is Reading the World, Branje besede je branje sveta. We are extremely happy and honored that Craig Murray is here with us in person. I just have to keep mentioning this, that he traveled, he had a lecture yesterday on Assange in Berlin yesterday evening, took the train today at 6 I think, came, so it traveled 11 plus hours to have a lecture here, and we leave tomorrow morning for Germany again to have a lecture on Assange in Frankfurt. So I think this is a really dedication to the cause, and I think really we are really extremely grateful. Otherwise, Craig Murray is Scottish journalist, political activist, writer, former British diplomat and ambassador to Uzbekistan, also himself a whistleblower on the crimes of the Uzbekistani government, committed with participation of the British government. We know him very well from his blog and his name, The Man in the Public Gallery at the Old Bailey, when he was reporting from the Old Bailey on the case of Julian Assange case. So he was there in the courtroom while the process was taking place. Also maybe worth mentioning that Craig Murray himself spent 4 months in prison last year when he was accused of the so-called jigsaw identification in the process against Alex Salmon. And if I'm not mistaken, you were actually the first British journalist to be imprisoned for jigsaw identification. Yeah, okay. But the prison sentence was probably a result of you campaigning and reporting on Julian Assange case, you can safely say, I think. Otherwise, for those of you, because today we have spoken about Wikileaks and Julian Assange already a bit, and have mentioned the disinterest of journalists into this case and Julian Assange, and it has been mentioned that perhaps sometimes it also has to do with the seemingly very complex situation that Julian Assange is in, or seemingly very complex case. So just now to recap what we know, and then Craig is here to give us a detailed story. And also, I think it's very important at the end that we can discuss what can we do here in Slovenia, how to put pressure either on the media, on the government to report more on Julian. So, as you know, Julian Assange is an Australian editor, publisher, and activist who founded Wikileaks in 2006, and he came to international attention in 2010 when Wikileaks published a series of leaks provided by US Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning, including leaks that showed war crimes committed with the knowledge of the US government. After the 2010 leak, the United States government launched a criminal investigation into Wikileaks, and Julian Assange has been held in detention for over 11 years. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has found that Julian Assange has been subjected to various forms of arbitrary deprivation of liberty since his arrest on 7th of December 2010. So soon it will be 12 years of a specific occasion, including 10 days of detention in London's Wandsworth Prison. He has spent 550 days of house arrest, and the continuation of the deprivation of liberty in Ecuadorian embassy in London, which lasted almost 7 years. Since 11th of April 2019, Assange has been held in total isolation at the maximum security prison in Belmarsh in London. And on the 17th of June 2022, Home Secretary of the United Kingdom, Priti Patel, granted the extradition of Julian Assange to the United States, setting a very dangerous precedent for all media publishers and journalists. Assange faces 175 years in a US prison under the 1917 Espionage Act for exposing evidence of US war crimes. Otherwise, Julian Assange is a journalist with many accolades, won Australia's most prestigious journalism award, the Walkley Award, after reporting evidence of US war crimes, which included the release of collateral murder revealing the 2007 slaying of Reuters journalists and unarmed civilians by US armed forces in Baghdad. He's also a credited member of the press, has won the Amnesty International Walkley Award and Times Magazine Award for his work, as well as countless international accolades. He has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize on several occasions, and maybe really important this year also Nils Meltzer's book. He was the UN Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, has written a book, The Trial of Julian Assange, and according to him, he says that Julian Assange has been deliberately exposed for a period of several years to progressively severe forms of cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, and the cumulative effects of this can only be described as psychological torture. So thank you, Craig, for coming, and I'm giving you now the opportunity to speak in detail about Assange.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is the microphone working okay? Yeah. Thank you. And yes, I had a long journey to get here, but I'm very happy to be here because I can meet you and see you, and we can talk afterwards. I was initially invited, I was contacted and was asked, would I be prepared to do a Zoom chat? Now, why would I do that when I can come and see you? This is much better. But there's another reason. Because I'm here, I can sit here and drink my wine, and you all think I'm just being friendly. And if I was doing a Zoom chat, sitting at home drinking my wine, you would all think there's a strange alcoholic on the end of the line. I should explain, however, I am Scottish. I'm from Edinburgh, which means that I run on alcohol. So if my glass looks like it's getting too small at any stage, please feel free to put another one in order to keep the talk going. Thank you. And I'd also say that I haven't been given any precise limit of how long to talk. I tend to go on too long. I can't, because of the lights, I can't actually see you. So I won't know when you are falling asleep. So please feel free to shout, shut up, whenever you feel I've talked too much. And also, we can do plenty of discussion and questions and answers when I've finished. But I don't want you to feel you have to just sit there. If I say something you disagree with or wish to amplify on, feel free to interrupt me. You know, I'm not the Pope. You can shout out anytime you want during the talk, and we can commence dialogue at any time that you want. And I will start, which seems a bit immodest, by saying a little bit about myself to explain how I got here. I used to be very much an establishment figure. I was in the British Foreign Office in our diplomatic service for 22 years. For the last 6 years of that, I was a member of what we call the senior management structure of the British Foreign Office. I became Britain's youngest ambassador. My career seemed to be very successful. I lived in Tashkent in a palace. It was actually the Kerensky Palace, which is where the former Russian Prime Minister, immediately before the Bolshevik Revolution, Kerensky was born in that place. And it was my home. I lived there. I had 12 servants. I had 6 gardeners. I had one man who I never found out what he was doing in 2 years. So I had the lifestyle of a big establishment figure, if you like. Life was rather good and looked like it would get even better. But while I was in that job, I stumbled across the fact that, and Uzbekistan is immediately north of Afghanistan. It has a border with Afghanistan. I was there shortly after the invasion of Afghanistan, during the height of what was called the War on Terror. And I discovered two things. Firstly, I discovered that people were being tortured and that the CIA and MI6 were accepting the intelligence from those torture sessions. And even that people were flown, people who were not Uzbek, were flown to Uzbekistan in order for them to be tortured. I also discovered that people under torture were confessing to membership of Al-Qaeda, and that this was building up the intelligence picture which Washington and London wanted. And it was completely false. People were confessing to being members of Al-Qaeda who were not members of Al-Qaeda. And let me give you one example. There was one professor from Tashkent who confessed under torture to being a member of Al-Qaeda, and this turned up in intelligence reports. And I knew the man. I had had dinner in his home, and he was a Jehovah's Witness. He was not a Muslim at all. Now, there are not many Jehovah's Witnesses in Al-Qaeda. I'm sure Al-Qaeda don't even try to get Jehovah's Witnesses to join them. So the intelligence was nonsense. And it was obtained by torture. And torture doesn't get you the truth. If you torture somebody, they don't tell you the truth. They tell you whatever it takes for you to stop torturing them. And if you want as a false picture, they will give you a false picture. And as it happened, purely by chance, I was also the former head of the Foreign Office section which monitored Iraqi arms procurement. So I knew that what we were being told about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction before the Iraq War was a lie. And it's not just I knew it wasn't true, I knew that the people who were saying it was true knew it wasn't true. I knew it was a deliberate lie to start a war. We all have to live our best life. You know, everybody has to make their own way in the world. And I was faced with a choice where I could continue with my career, continue working for my government, continue being a senior diplomat, and acknowledge that that involved complicity in people being tortured, and it involved telling lies in order to start wars, in order to steal resources. Or I could think, no, I don't have to do this. You know, I can be poor, but go get drunk with people in Maribor. And I made the second choice. I thought, no, I cannot any longer go along with this. So I became a whistleblower. I blew the whistle. When I initially tried to stop getting intelligence from torture, I wrote official, the Americans call them cables, we call them telegrams in the UK, official correspondence from the ambassador to the foreign minister. I wrote official telegrams to our foreign minister saying, we are getting intelligence from torture, this is illegal, we must stop. And the British government made the big mistake of sending me back a reply giving their legal opinion saying it is not illegal to get intelligence from torture. So that gave me something to leak to the, which I did to the Financial Times. So I became myself a whistleblower. It was the end of my career. I went through a rather difficult period, but I ended up in a situation where I got to know other wonderful whistleblowers, people like Catherine Gunn, who blew the whistle on the fact that in the run-up to the vote on the Iraq War, the UK and the US were bugging other delegations inside the United Nations building in New York. And she blew the whistle on that, for example. So I entered the community of whistleblowers. And that's how I became a friend and colleague of Julian Assange, which I'm proud to say I've been for many, many years now. And I cooperated with Julian and WikiLeaks on a number of issues. I knew him before he entered the Ecuador embassy and throughout that period. And Julian's view, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but if lies can be used to start wars, then the truth can be used to stop wars. And I think that's a profound perception. I think that's extremely important. I think that's one reason why telling the truth is always a virtue in itself. You know, it's a good in itself to be truthful and open. And WikiLeaks gave us this totally new perspective. When WikiLeaks had their huge coup and published the Iraqi war logs and the Afghan war logs and the diplomatic cables leaked to them by Chelsea Manning, it was explosive. Because many of us, of course, always realized that the Iraq and Afghan wars were fake and we were invading other people's countries on a false perspective. But those leaks opened the eyes of many people who did not come from that assumption, who had believed the lies of governments and the lies of the media. They opened their eyes to the war crimes that were happening. There was a huge revolt in the world against the crimes, particularly the crimes of the United States. And also, of course, the diplomatic cables in particular helped fuel revolts against corrupt governments in many other places, including much of the Arab world. So WikiLeaks had this enormous effect of removing the barrier between the citizen and the sources of information. Because before that, you only, if a lot of material had been leaked, you only got to know the bit of it that the journalists chose to publish or highlight. What WikiLeaks did was cut out the middleman, if you like, and bring in this idea that the citizen should have access to that vast source of material which governments keep secret. And what we learned, of course, which I knew already having been on the inside, but which many people, of course, did not realize, what we learned was that the main reason governments keep things secret is nothing to do, they say it's for national security, it's nothing to do with national security, it's because they would be embarrassed by the corruption and the double dealing which is revealed when the truth comes out, and by the crimes that they commit. And the empowerment of citizens in knowing what the governments do. And it astonishes me that we have to sit here and say this. I mean, we, all of us here, all the people in power, all those state functionaries, all the ministers, they're paid by us. They should be our servants. They shouldn't be ruling over us and telling us what to do. But unfortunately, that's not the way society has developed. And WikiLeaks, of course, this explosion of information was dependent upon internet access and the freedom of the internet for people to be able to get in and see this stuff, and of course for the internet to tell them that the stuff was available. And we had this great time of hope, I think, that the internet and citizen journalism, blogging, and the WikiLeaks and the availability of material on the internet would fundamentally change citizens' access to knowledge. And about 2010, around that time, was a period of great hope. Since then, we've seen the incarceration of Julian, initially on completely false allegations made against him, and the state knows what they are doing. Secret services know what they are doing. And if you look through history, they always, when they want to bring somebody down who they view as an enemy of the state, they invariably go for sexual allegations. Because these kind of allegations damn somebody in the eyes of society. And of course, going for sexual allegations because unfortunately it is the case that the vast majority of genuine sexual allegations never come to trial and are never properly proven in court, because there is that undercurrent, that basic foundation of injustice in the system. It means that many people, particularly on the left, have taken the view that if you're accused of sexual allegations, you're automatically guilty. And so the use of fake sexual allegations to split the left is what was done very effectively against Julian. And it's the oldest trick in the book. And this pulled away the support of the liberal media from Julian. We've seen the incarceration of Julian, and we've also seen a closing up of the internet. My own blog, for example, nowadays is invisible on Google. A few years ago, at the time I blew the whistle, the foreign minister who approved of torture, his name was Jack Straw. And at that time, if you Googled the name Jack Straw, 4 of the top 10 answers that came up would be my blog and things about Jack Straw and torture. Nowadays, even though he hasn't been, it's not because he has done more things. He left government shortly afterwards. He's been totally obscure for many years. Nowadays, if you Google Jack Straw, you can't find. Even if you even if you Google Jack Straw Craig Murray, you can't find one of the articles on my blog because Google has suppressed them deliberately. My blog doesn't come up. My blog is has the third largest readership of any non-mainstream media site in the UK. It doesn't come up in Google searches at all. It's actually hard to find it even if you Google my name. And the same is true on Facebook, the same is true on Twitter, and it's not just me. Wikileaks have 2 million Twitter followers. 2 million. In fact, I believe it's more than that. It was 2 million last time I looked at it. The average reach of their tweets when they put them out is about 6,000 people who actually see them. And that is a deliberate closing down of the avenues of information by the corporate gatekeepers, because the period of internet openness, just for reasons, not for any particularly sinister reasons, but just for reasons of social development, have changed. And now the vast amount of traffic on the internet goes through corporate gatekeepers. It goes to Facebook, it goes to Instagram, it goes to Twitter. That's how people see news and click on things. And left-wing sites and libertarian freedom of information sites are routinely suppressed and deranked by those corporations. And that is having a huge effect. So internet freedom hasn't worked out in the way that we thought it would work. And that's something we have to find a way. And people have tried setting up alternative social media sites that are more geared to the left and that kind of thing, but none of this has really worked. And in a sense, that's one of the reasons I want my friend Julian to be with us. And it's not just because he is the victim of a terrible injustice. He is a man imprisoned in our worst jail for terrorists, a man suffering every day under appalling conditions of imprisonment, meant only for the very worst kind of killers. It's not just because of what's happening to my friend, it's because we need him. We need his leadership ability, we need his creativity, we need to see what is the next great thing that Julian Assange will invent. And that is being taken away from us. So yes, this is a question of fighting injustice, but it's also a question of wanting to return one of the major assets that the freedom-loving people have, return that to us and get Julian working again. I want to give you an example of where things go wrong. And that would be, I'm not sure how many of you remember this. It's 5 or 6 years ago now. There were documents released called the Panama Papers, which were where a whistleblower leaked the private documents of a law company which handled the offshore money laundering accounts of numerous billionaires operating out of Panama, where corporations and people hid their money. Now, this whistleblower didn't go to Wikileaks. They gave the documents to the mainstream media. And what was the result? I'm not sure what you saw here in Slovenia. In the UK, The Guardian, which was the main mainstream media outlet which got the papers, it ran 5 days of front-page headlines on the Panama Papers. And the first day said, Putin's chef hides money in Panama. And the second day said, Russian billionaires hide money. And every single article was about Russians hiding money in Panama. There wasn't one single article about any American hiding money in Panama, even though Panama is the go-to place for crooked Americans to hide their money. And just, it's what I was telling you about releasing the source material so you see everything, or giving the mainstream media selectivity as to what you see. Because in fact, Russian money, and please, Russia is an extremely corrupt country, and Putin is no end of a working class. I'm not saying that there's no corruption in Russia. There is. But corrupt Russian money is a tiny percentage of the money held in Panama, which is largely corrupt American money, of which the media told you nothing in reporting that story. And we never, despite promises that the documentation would be published, we never got to see any of the original documentation. And that's the difficulty, because you see what you are fed. No, you would have seen people who simply take in what the media tells them, would have seen a story that Panama is a massive center of Russian money laundering, and apparently has no American involvement at all. And I don't know how we get away from this. It's very, very difficult. WikiLeaks is still operating, but the amount of super high quality information that comes into WikiLeaks nowadays is limited, and partly that's because people, of course, are being terrified by what's happened to Julian, by what's happened to Chelsea Manning. People are, by what's happened to me to some extent, people are scared to get involved with WikiLeaks because they think if you get involved with WikiLeaks, you'll go to jail. And there's a certain amount of truth in that. But no, freedom has never been obtained without some people going to jail, unfortunately. You don't get given freedom by the authorities. You have to take freedom from the authorities. That's the only way people can get back the power that ought to be invested in them. We live in very difficult times. Some of the things that have happened in Julian's trial are unbelievable. I sat there every day in the public gallery, every day taking notes. They tried to close the public gallery and not allow anybody in at all. The media weren't allowed in. Amnesty International were banned. Reporters Without Borders were banned. It was quite extraordinary. And they would only allow, for long periods, they would only allow in 2 members of Julian Assange's family, and that was the entire public gallery. So I became Julian's uncle, and I sat there with his father for every single day I got in, and otherwise nobody would know what happened in the Assange trial. But the Assange extradition proceedings, if you look at the entire coverage, all the coverage of 5.5 weeks of the Assange extradition proceedings, and again, I go back to The Guardian because it's where I was checking. There was a total of 16 column inches in The Guardian of coverage of the Assange extradition proceedings. There was a total of 480 column inches in The Guardian of Johnny Depp, Amber Heard divorce trial. And that's supposed to be the most serious intellectual paper in the UK. Because that's where our media are. They're much more interested in, celebrities throwing shit at each other than they are in the trial of a man for espionage simply for journalism. Even when that opens up every journalism in the world to extradition to the United States if they publish any secret of the United States. The media aren't interested. They don't care. They don't want you to know. But among the things, I'll just very briefly give 2 or 3 examples of the amazing things about Julian Assange's trial. The first one is, of course, that the security firm UC Global, who were providing security to the Ecuador embassy, were spying on him and videoing him the whole time. They took the telephones of everybody who visited him and took all the, because you had to hand over your phone from when you went in. While you were away, those phones were stripped of all their data. So they took all the data of all the phones of everybody who visited Julian, including his lawyers. They then videoed all the meetings. There are numerous videos of myself with Julian. I'm very, very angry because I've seen these videos, and the CIA had these hyper-intelligent cameras which always focused on the bald spot on the top of my head, which is very, very embarrassing. But there are just record after record after record of all Julian's conversations. His conversations with me at that time, at the time this was happening, were largely about if he were to be able to be got by legal means out of jail, where will he go and live? And I went on his behalf to several countries overseas to negotiate with the governments of those countries as to whether they would be prepared to host Wikileaks. And it was our discussions on that series of events which the CIA was taping. But they also taped his legal conversations with his lawyers about how to avoid extradition and about how to fight the extradition proceedings. So you have the United States government, which is one party in the legal hearings in the UK, trying to extradite Julian Assange, who is the other party. And one party in the case has secretly spied on and taped the defence's conversations with their lawyers. Now, there's no country in the entire world where that wouldn't have a case dismissed. You can't have 2 parties in court and one party spied on the lawyers of the other party. That's plainly, absolutely, any case would simply be dismissed on those grounds. And the fact that Julian's case has not been, I think is, that's one of the starkest examples of how this is not about, this is political, it's not about the normal workings of the justice system. And similarly, when Julian was in the Ecuadorian embassy, you may recall that when he left, he was looking very ragged with a long beard, and he looked dirty and unshaven, and he looked a bit crazy, bluntly. And that's because for his last year there, after the government in Ecuador changed, with the help of the CIA, after the government in Ecuador changed, he was effectively a prisoner in the embassy. And they would not allow him to leave his room, to go to the bathroom. They would not allow him to shave. I phoned the Ecuadorian embassy and spoke to the first secretary of the embassy 2 days before his arrest, because we knew he was about to be removed from the embassy. Because we have our spies too, particularly in Ecuador. And we knew, for example, that the British ambassador and the American ambassador had every day for a fortnight, every single day, been going together into the Ecuadorian foreign ministry in Quito. And that this was all being organized. We knew it was being organized. So I phoned the embassy and I said, if you want Julian to leave, I said, we're very grateful for your hospitality. If you want Julian to leave, he will leave. Just tell us, he will go. You don't have to do anything, spectacular. If you want him to go, he will go. We have no desire to inconvenience you. And they said, no, of course not, of course not. 2 days later, he was arrested. And the reason they did it that way was so that he could be dragged out looking ragged and unkempt, because that helped keep the false image of him, which had been built up carefully by government leaks to a compliant media. And also, so they could seize his papers. And they seized all his papers. They didn't let him take, when he was taken out, he wasn't allowed any of his property, and his family weren't allowed any of his property. It was all taken to Quito, including his legal papers. All his legal defense papers were taken to Quito, and there the Ecuadorian government handed them over to the CIA. So here again, you have a legal case where one side not only spied on the lawyers of the other side, they also have all the legal documents of the other side which they have stolen. And again, the judges have not dismissed the case on that basis. And any other case, that would be calls for dismissal. But, you know, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, but the political establishment, and that, I think this is true everywhere in the West, I don't think it's unique to the UK, but political establishment is extremely corrupt. And those of us who believe, you know, to believe in the myths we were taught about judicial independence and democracy, you know, it's all lies, unfortunately. It's a charade, which is simply untrue. And that's hard to learn, you know, and it's hard for me, having been, as I told you, initially a member of that establishment, to come to realize just how extremely rotten it is. And that's the reason why, you know, this is much wider than Julian. Yes, it's a terrible injustice, but it's much wider than one man, because it points up so many of the dreadful injustices which affect our society and which affect every single one of us. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I see we already have questions, so yeah, a hand is up there. Maybe a microphone from my colleagues to the.
I'm holding off.
We need it because we are recording.
Just was wondering what is keeping him going.
I think he still retains hope that he will be able eventually to get out of this. He also, of course, has 2 young children, and that is a tremendous motivator for anybody. He has had very, very black times. You know, there have been times when we were worried about suicide. He was worried about suicide, and it's very difficult to see the world outside, particularly when you're somebody like Julian, who has had a real effect on the world, and for you to be locked in and silenced and have no voice and be unable to affect it. And perhaps the worst psychological torture of all is he has no idea when it will end. You know, this has gone on for years and years and years, and there's no fixed limit to it. You know, he's a man of great intellect. He's a man of great humor. He's very funny. And if you can find humor in the little events of life, that often helps keep you going as well. So I think love and affection of his family and friends, and also it's very important, and it sounds a small thing, but for people simply to write to him in prison helps an awful lot, for him to know there are people outside who love him and care for him and are thinking about him. That also very much helps keep him going. But I'm happy to say, in my view, his physical health seems to have improved a little bit. which is very important because we were very, very, very seriously worried about his deterioration. But yeah, a determination to struggle on and being surrounded by warmth and love, even if it's not in jail with him, I think is what keeps him going. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, a question?
I was wondering what's happening with Wikileaks in the parallels, so with the organization itself, how much there's communication between Assange and Wikileaks, but also Wikileaks in itself, is it under attack even more now in the process, or it's been forgotten because Assange is it's pulling all the attention, so I would be interested in that.
And WikiLeaks continues. They continue to do good work. They continue to publish interesting stuff. Nothing with quite, the spectacular impact of some of the things they've had in the past yet, but we don't know what's coming because, of course, WikiLeaks basically works on a Dropbox system whereby whistleblowers come to them. You never know who's coming down the corner next. They have an excellent editor-in-chief, Kristin Raffenson, and Kristin continues to work very, very carefully on journalism. Kristin is an Icelandic journalist and a real journalist. He's a very good, professional, source-checking, careful journalist. And he keeps WikiLeaks on track, while at the same time being involved in the campaign to the Julian. But it's very important to us that WikiLeaks keeps up its work and its publication and doesn't simply become a campaigning organisation to keep Julian out. Of course, that's difficult. And of course, it's fair to say that the campaign for Julian sucks resources out of WikiLeaks, which reduces its output. I think that's inevitable. It's very hard to avoid that happening. If I may just give one example. WikiLeaks were given a full copy of Hunter Biden's hard drive a few months ago and verified that it was genuine. But they went to do the hard drive. They were looking to see also if anything could be recovered that could be deleted, that had been deleted, if there's anything hidden still there. And I think that work may be continuing. But in terms of what was still there, and I had this conversation personally with Kristin Raffenson, the decision was made that everything that was really important because it indicated possible corruption or abuse of Joe Biden's influence for money had already been published, right? Had already been got into the public domain and published, even though at the time it was denied and deemed fake. Although now, even the New York Post and the Washington Times are now admitting it's genuine. The rest of the stuff on the laptop, although there was a huge amount of stuff concerning both things, things like videos and also mundane emails and things concerning drugs and prostitution and all that side of things. It wasn't actually political, if you like. It wasn't to do with the influence of his father. It was just how he was spending his money. Whether he got his money legally or not, that stuff had already been published. What he did with his money and his personal lifestyle, that's tabloid stuff. And it's not for WikiLeaks. So it was decided not to publish it. But those kind of careful investigations and editorial decisions are continuing every day with material that comes in. But yes, it's very difficult. I mean, it's difficult to keep it all going and at the same time be all the time campaigning for Julian's release. It's a strain.
Yeah, I also don't see people very well because of the light. So put your hands up, the ones who are wanting to ask the question. So, Otherwise, maybe if we continue with the what to ask a question? Yeah, if we continue with the, I will just ask because it's a connection to Zala's question. If we continue with WikiLeaks, there is a constant attack also by mainstream media on WikiLeaks. I was just recently watching an interview. I think it was a BBC journalist doing an interview with Chelsea Manning when he accused her of just dumping the documents to WikiLeaks without taking in consideration the repercussions that the Taliban government might have, what Taliban government can do to the people that were mentioned in the documents. And this is continuously being, propagated through mainstream media. So this is just dumping the documents, while we know, and you already mentioned, that WikiLeaks does a thorough verification, hides the names, if it offers the documents to the journalists, gives them the coded versions, and the journalists should specifically ask for codes. And this was exactly what happened, that the journalist of The Guardian, I think, exposed actually the names of the people mentioned in the documents, and didn't respect WikiLeaks basically safeguarding those people.
No, that's true. Yeah, I saw that interview as well with Stephen Sakur and Chelsea Manning. And I mean, Chelsea was making the point that in Chelsea's court-martial, the American government was unable to prove anybody had been harmed, and in fact ended up admitting nobody had been harmed. But Chelsea wasn't making that point very well. I don't know. Chelsea's obviously a person of very strong and brave, courageous moral beliefs, but that doesn't make you a good interviewee. If you see what I mean, you can be intellectually very clever, very moral, very strong, but you may not be able to come back quickly to a journalist who's pressing you hard, and that's how I felt that BBC interview went. But yes, it's one of the persistent lies about WikiLeaks is that they caused a lot of collaborators with the United States to be killed or injured as a result of revealing their names. But there was, and details of this were heard in the court case, numerous witnesses who are senior journalists gave evidence to say that when the documents were released, there was a process which lasted nearly a year of going through every document that was released and censoring out any information that may cause anybody to be physically harmed, removing key names. And I just say, what then happened was that the cache in the cloud, which The Guardian had access to, the journalists of The Guardian thought it would be clever or a joke to publish the password as a chapter heading in a book about WikiLeaks. And of course, eventually, somewhere around the world, somebody worked out that chapter heading was the password. And after that, it all became public. And Cryptome.org were actually the first people to publish the full, unedited and unredacted cache. But even then, there is no evidence. Even then, there is no evidence anybody was actually harmed. And I'm sure if anybody was actually harmed, we would see the evidence. But, the media would be delighted to publish. The CIA would be broadcasting it everywhere, that this person was harmed because of what was said in WikiLeaks. But also, this reminds me of another one of the perfectly astonishing things about the extradition trial of Julian Assange. In that same book by The Guardian journalists, they claim that they had dinner with Julian Assange, and they say that at dinner, Julian Assange said, "I don't care if Afghan traitors get killed, informants get killed, they're traitors and they should be killed anyway." And the American government lawyer, the lawyer represented at the extradition hearing, on 3 separate occasions, he read out that passage from a book each time with a different excuse for reading it. One time, it was because it was meant to show that Julian could put together coherent sentences so he couldn't be suffering from Asperger's. And the sentence he happened to choose was the one saying, these people should be shot. But Julian has always denied he ever said that. Always denied he ever said that. And there was one of the witnesses in court, Sebastian Goertz of Spiegel, Der Spiegel. Sebastian Goertz was giving evidence, and he was the fourth person at the dinner. The dinner was Julian, Sebastian Goertz, and the two Guardian journalists. And Sebastian Goertz wanted to give evidence, but he was there, and Julian did not say it. It was a lie. He never said it. And despite the fact that the quote from a book had been 3 times introduced into evidence, Sebastian Goertz was not allowed by the court to say he did not say it. Or rather, Sebastian Goertz said in court, it's a lie, he didn't say that. And the judge said, no, that's not on the record, strike that from the record, because that's not what you're here to give evidence about. You're here to give evidence from a different subject. And that's amazing. You know, there was no witness in court, but the Guardian journalists went to the court to swear that he said it. It was just read out as a passage from this book, entered into the court record 3 times, and the person who was actually there was not allowed to swear it wasn't true. And that to me is, you know, it's just yet another instance. You had to be there to believe. You couldn't. It was very hard to believe this was really happening before your eyes. It was like something from Kafka. It really was. You know, you couldn't think. To believe this is actually really happening. I'm not dreaming this. This is the power of the state being abused in this totalitarian fashion. It was absolutely astonishing. I'm sorry, I digressed from the subject, but I wanted to add that one.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would be interested in what advice you would give to people who get this kind of information on wrongdoings, either by the government or a big company, or you know, that the public needs to know about, how to go about it. So who do you contact? How do you contact them? Can you stay anonymous, or if you stay anonymous, does it take away from the weight of the information and so on?
I've always advised whistleblowers, if it's something big, to go to Wikileaks in the first instance, even if it's local, if it's a large story, go to Wikileaks with it. And Wikileaks work as an anonymous Dropbox. So you just send it to them anonymously. You can contact them if you want and reveal your identity, but they don't have to know who you are. And in many cases, they don't know who the person they got information from was. They published the Saudi diplomatic files, for example. They don't know who that came from. Which makes a lot of work. If you don't know where it's from, you have to do a huge amount of work to back up and authenticate that the documents are real. The question of whether you should remain anonymous or whether you should come out, I think, yes, obviously it strengthens the credibility of what you are doing if the whistleblower is prepared to put themselves up front. But on the other hand, it's not easy being a whistleblower. You know, I realized when I became a whistleblower, I did it with clear eyes and realized I will never be employed again. Nobody will ever employ me again. Because any employer, the one thing they value most in an employee, above any ability or anything else, is loyalty to the employer. That's what they want, your loyalty. And if you can't guarantee you will be loyal to them even when they're doing something wrong, they don't want you. People don't want to employ honest people. That's a strange thing to say, but sadly it appears to be true in life. And people have responsibilities, they have families, they have all kinds of ties. So I do understand when people don't, wish to whistleblow and remain anonymous. And WikiLeaks' entire setup is designed around keeping sources anonymous, which sometimes can be harmful. In the 2016 US presidential election, when WikiLeaks obtained the emails from the Democratic National Congress that showed that the primary election was corrupt, that it had been manipulated in various ways so that Bernie Sanders did not beat Hillary Clinton. When they received those emails, Hillary Clinton almost immediately claimed that this was Russian hacking and Russia had given the emails to WikiLeaks. My view was always, what does it matter? If they're genuine emails, if they show that you faked the election to defeat Bernie Sanders, why does it matter who hacked them? Whoever hacked them did a very good job. But that's not everybody's opinion. And of course it works very well. You say it's the Russians, and then immediately that in some way invalidates the information, even if you're not actually denying the information is true. But when she came out and said it's the Russians, I said to Julian, look, this is damaging you because it's associating you with the Russians in the public mind and in the media's mind. This narrative is designed to damage you. Why don't you come out and say it's not the Russians? You don't have to say who it really was, but just say it's not the Russians. To say, I did not get this from the Russians, because you didn't get it from the Russians. Why don't you say that? And he said, our policy is we never comment on sources. He said, and as soon as you say anything about who a source is, you're exposing your actual source. Once you say it's not the Russians, then you're focusing attention elsewhere and endangering your real source. So even in a circumstance where it hurt him, and it's hurt him ever since, to tell the truth, he's always put source protection as the absolute number one thing. And that's why anybody who links to WikiLeaks can be 100% certain that their identity will be protected.
Any questions? I think get a hand up. Also, so if people want to ask questions in Slovenian, I can ask it. They can ask in Slovenian, and we can translate.
On your opinion, who or what is new anonymous?
I'm sorry, I don't think I know you anonymous. I don't think I can help.
Other one? Where I can't see anyone. Sorry. Sorry.
Given what you were saying about the fiction of an independent judiciary, how do you assess Julian's possibility for release within the next 1 or 2 years, for example?
I think it's entirely political. I don't think it really depends on the judiciary. I don't think... I've explained already some of the reasons why legal argumentation would have had him released already. I don't think it has anything to do with how good the arguments you make in court are. It depends entirely on the politicians, and unfortunately, politicians work in their self-interest. They don't work for the interest of anybody else but themselves. And I'm sorry to say that. It's something which I didn't believe 20 years ago, but which I've come to be absolutely certain of. And I wish I was not. I wish I had more belief in the goodwill and genuine intentions of politicians. And it depends on the United States, because the United Kingdom will do whatever the United States says. And that's true in almost any field. The United Kingdom is a kind of servant of the United States in international affairs. I was, even though Biden said some very bad things about Assange when Biden was in opposition, and back in the days of the Obama administration, I was slightly surprised that the Biden administration continued so wholeheartedly with the extradition request, even because now the New York Times and the Washington Post and the kind of liberal establishment in the United States has come out against the extradition. So I'm a little bit surprised that the Biden administration is continuing with it. And I think that's basically because it's the United States Security Services. The security services are determined to get Julian for releasing that classified information and to get him under the Espionage Act. That's very much a security service agenda. So how this plays out is largely a factor of US politics, but Biden has to balance, and it's going to be Biden personally who decides, I've no doubt about that. But Biden has to balance the weight and influence of the security services, which is greater and greater. The extent to which politicians control security services or security services control politicians has, I think, changed over the last few decades. And I think the security services nowadays are much in control. He's got to balance that against his more liberal constituency and his more liberal media. And he's also got to balance that against pressure put on him by allies. And the president of Mexico has come out very strongly in favor of Julian and made some remarkably strong statements in the last couple of months. And the president of Colombia came out last week and made a strong statement. And we are very confident that Lula will now come out with a strong statement from Brazil. And relations with the complexity of relations between a democratic president and South America also weighs. And then we need to get the European Union to weigh in. Educated opinion in the European Union has changed enormously in the last 3 or 4 years in favour of Julian's release or Julian not being extradited to the United States. Getting that through so governments want to take action is where we are now, because that hurdle hasn't really been crossed yet. But it's a little bit like, well, the obvious parallel is the campaign to free Nelson Mandela, where popular actions, popular demonstrations, radical activity, including direct action at street level, fed through into also an intellectual consensus that came to include the mainstream media, who were not all on side at all at the start. I'm old enough to remember when the British mainstream media still called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. Those things change over time, and then you have to get the influence on the politicians, and then other states putting pressure on the state that makes the decision. So I think we need to build up in that way, and I think it's very, very complex. And I think every single part of that, direct action, popular political activity, demonstrations, rallies, getting stuff in the media, letters to members of parliament, due to getting the local newspapers to write editorials about it, due to getting local politicians, then through to the national level, people to put pressure on the President of the United States. All of that has to be done, and it's not quick. But we've been at it for several years, and it feels like progress is being made. And I'm not despondent. I'm reasonably confident we will get a good result. But it's nothing to do with that. The judges will do what they are told.
Go ahead. Please, Nico. Okay, sorry.
Thank you very much for your speech. I wanted to ask about the truth and how do you locate the power, political power of Wikileaks and cause of Julian Assange in garnering support from the people when we are living in a context where the truth seems not to be the primary concern of in many countries that is exemplified by the post-truth age. So do you think that Wikileaks is still powerful to mobilize people when Orban is so powerful, Meloni is so powerful, Trump is powerful, Erdogan is powerful, so how truth can beat them, or is it possible? What's your opinion? Thank you.
It's a big problem, and in my view, it's not only, you've named, if you like, the populist right-wing political surge that's going on internationally at the moment. But I think, in a sense, that can be misleading because it almost gives the impression that normal, if you like, Western politics are okay, and it's only these right-wing people who are a problem. Whereas in fact, exactly the same problem, just slightly more disguised, exists in all the Western countries. And I'm very worried indeed about the meaningfulness of Western democracy, because it was perfectly possible a few decades ago to have, in pretty well every Western country, you had political parties which had genuine ideological differences and quite radically different political agendas contesting for mainstream votes. Whereas now, throughout Europe, all the mainstream parties are signed up to the same neoliberal agenda. And the amount of real democratic choice, whoever you vote for, you're going to get politicians who want to increasingly privatize public services to profit-making companies. There's no one you can vote for who doesn't want to do that, who has any chance of getting elected or of any mainstream media support. There's a real democratic deficit. And that is also reflected in the media, that the window of opinions which are viewed as respectable to be carried in the media is as narrow as the window of opinions which the main political parties hold. And I really don't, and the rhetoric of people like Maloney is disgusting. But in terms of policies and what really happens, it's not that different to what the mainstream parties also do. There's almost no political choice out there which wouldn't have, when I was a young man, and I know this is a long time ago, but when I was a young man in the United Kingdom, all of the public utilities, electricity, gas, oil, all of that was nationalized. It all belonged to the state. Every natural monopoly, if you like, belonged to the state, and several major industries belonged to the state. None of that belongs to the state anymore. It's now all run rapaciously by for-profit companies. And although we still have things like a national health service, if you go along to your national health service, you're actually having your blood taken and tested and whatever by a private company that's been given that contract out. The state used to do it, but now it's being done by a private company that's sucking profit out of the system. And there's much more interested in making profit than is in what's happening in your blood. And there's no party that stands against that. You know, the level of political choice available to people. When I was 14 years old, I joined the Liberal Party in my country. I still consider myself a liberal. I don't consider myself a socialist. But I believed in what everybody in the UK believed in. I believed the state should own the electricity companies. I believed the state should own the gas companies. I believed the state should own the railways. I believed people should go to university and not pay any tuition fees. I believed all those things. Everybody believed all those things. I haven't changed my political opinions at all. I still believe exactly the same things I believed when I was 14. I am now a far-left Marxist, apparently, because everybody else in the political spectrum has moved so far to the right. And there are no political opinions permitted in the mainstream media or by major political parties which we would not have characterized not just as right-wing, but far right-wing. Many, back in the 70s, and part of that, and forgive me, we're getting way off topic. I do apologize. Part of that is that there has been, on a philosophical level, there is a denial of the power of altruism. Society nowadays is increasingly ordered along the lines that nobody does anything ever to help anybody else. People only do things for personal profit. It's the only thing that motivates us. And the idea that you may choose to be a nurse, not because you can make a lot of money being a nurse, but because you want to help people, because that's the profession you want. That idea is gone. The idea that services should be provided because they are services to the public and you want to help the public, not because you want to make millions of dollars out of people's bins being empty. You know, that idea is gone. There is a philosophical denial of the power of community spirit and the power of altruism. And that has been a fundamental change in society, which I think makes society sick. If you base the entire functioning of your society on the grounds that all anybody wants is to make money, you're going to end up with a society which is horrible to live in. And I fear that is where we are going. And I do apologize for straying away from the comment.
We have the next questioner.
What would Assange's fate have been if Jeremy Corbyn would have become Prime Minister of Britain? Would he have entered a direct conflict with the United States over Assange?
I think, yes, I'm not, like Julian, Jeremy is also somebody I know. I could call Julian a friend. I don't know Jeremy that well. I've spoken on the platform with him on many occasions. I wouldn't call him a friend, partly because he never drinks alcohol, so we never have any occasion to talk together. But I'm sure Julian, I am sure Jeremy, had he got into power, would have released Julian. But I'm also sure that's one of the reasons he was not allowed into power. And I think what happened to Jeremy Corbyn in the UK would be the entire media and political establishment piling in, calling him a racist and anti-Semite and saying things about him which are just simply untrue, terrible lies about the poor man. And even, extraordinary things. The BBC showing pictures of him which were photoshopped to have him wearing a Russian hat. And those kind of extraordinary smears and slurs. Partly it's what I was talking about. You're not. Jeremy is only slightly left wing. He's a slightly left wing person, and the idea of him being in power was such a threat to the establishment that they went on this massive character assassination. Yes, I have no doubt at all that Jeremy would have prevented the extradition of Julian Assange had he come to power. But I also have no doubt that's one of, that's an example of the reasons why they stopped him coming to power.
Maybe we can suggest to people to watch Al Jazeera documentary series on framing Corbyn. It's recent, so yeah. recommended watch?
Yeah, I think that there's no such fear from Keir Starmer, even if they come into power, right? Because he's a Blairite and as such complicit into the original Iraqi war and so on, right? Anyway, this was more of a comment, sorry. You may, of course, I mean, I'd be happy if you would answer, but basically I'm just offering the mic and rambling on. If anyone has other questions.
If you want to answer,
no, I mean, Keir Starmer is a clear example of what I was saying, that you are being offered a choice. Keir Starmer is just as right-wing as the Conservative Party. It makes even he's supposed to represent the Labour Party, and he had one of his MPs sacked and deselected as an MP because he stood on the picket line with striking railway workers, and that's meant to be the Labour Party. Unfortunately, and it also goes back to what I was saying about the Democratic National Committee and how they fixed the primary elections against Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders was the same as Jeremy Corbyn. This was a chance for a left-wing leader to actually make some changes in society. Modest ones. I mean, neither Bernie nor Jeremy are revolutionaries, but they would have made some changes in a left-wing direction, and all kinds of dirty tricks were paid to stop them getting into power. And I personally have no doubt at all that if those dirty tricks had been failing and they were still getting into power, they would have been assassinated. They would have been killed. That's the way that the system protects itself.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to ask, what do you think, what should we or what could we learn out of this case of Assange in terms of safety or protection of future whistleblowers?
And for me, the fascinating thing is that they've gone after a journalist, because Julian, of course, isn't a whistleblower. He's a journalist. The whistleblower was Chelsea Manning, and then other people who also... Chelsea, in terms of the stuff for which Julian is being extradited, it's Chelsea who was the whistleblower. And I give the parallel to people in this sense. When I myself leaked the documents on torture and extraordinary rendition, I gave them to the Financial Times. Now, at the time, I fully expected to go to prison myself, because I was a British ambassador. I decided to blow the whistle. I had decided to leak secret documents. And when you do that, you accept there will be consequences. In fact, I didn't go to prison because the government was worried I would have had a jury trial. They were worried that a jury would not convict me, because although there was no doubt I had done it, the jury would think, oh, well, you did the right thing. And the same thing happened, exactly the same thing happened in another high-profile whistleblowing case in the UK, Clive Ponting, which relates to the Falklands War. I won't go into detail on that. But there again, all the evidence was he was guilty. There was no doubt he was guilty. He leaked the documents, which showed basically that the UK had unnecessarily sunk the Argentinian battleship, General Belgrano, at a time when it was sailing away from the Falklands, and had claimed it was sailing towards the Falklands, and they were lying. And I think 400 people died when they sunk that battleship. He leaked the documents that showed that the government lied and it was actually leaving the Falklands and going back to Argentina when they sank it. And the jury refused to, even though at the trial, at the end, the judge gave his summing up of the case to the jury before they, and the jury said, the judge said to the jury, you must convict, you must find him guilty, the evidence is plainly he was guilty and he is not denying he was guilty. And the jury came back and said not guilty because they thought he did the right thing. And the government were worried the same thing would happen in my case. And I was therefore responsible for a change in the law, because after my case, they changed the law, so now there is no longer a jury in official secrets trials. You only get a judge who will say you are guilty. Sorry, I wandered so far off track, I forgot the question.
The question was like, what can we do to protect the...
Yes, what could we learn from the situation?
Yeah, I understand. But I would have been astonished. I was prepared to go to jail. I would have been astonished if they'd sent the Financial Times journalists to jail who published it. Now, it's the same with Chelsea. You know, Chelsea went to jail, and you expect that as a whistleblower. You don't expect the journalists to go to jail. This is what is so amazingly unprecedented about this case.
Also, the planning of kidnapping or assassination by U.S. government. This is something that is used in methods of the so-called war of terror, and is used now on journalists.
I mean, that was quite astonishing that Mike Pompeo was looking at means by which Julian could be kidnapped or assassinated from the Ecuadorian embassy, and plainly just illegal in so many ways. And the idea that now you would extradite somebody back to the statement that was plotting to assassinate them is just absolutely appalling. But I was coming back to say that it's interesting because protection for whistleblowers is always difficult because and it is largely a matter of law. And really you can protect whistleblowers by whistleblowers not being caught, and that's where the Dropbox and anonymity of sources helps. Or you can protect them by having a public interest defense in law where it says that if your whistleblowing was in the public interest, then you are not guilty. That gives the courts a chance to assess whether you did the right thing or not, simply, as opposed to it simply being a crime to leak documents of your employer. In the UK, the public interest, that same change in the law eliminated the public interest defense. So it's no longer a defense in law to say what I did was in the interests of the public. It simply becomes a question, did you leak the official document? If you did, you are going to prison. It doesn't matter why or what was in it. Protection of whistleblowers comes down to source protection, so they don't get caught in the first place, or to having the correct legal protections in place. But those, not just in the UK. If you look in countries across the Western world, those legal protections for public interest defense for whistleblowing are being removed everywhere. There was a time 20, 30 years ago when governments were prepared to say that whistleblowing is a good thing, we should support it, we should encourage it, it makes organizations more efficient. Those times are gone. They are now obsessed with cracking down on whistleblowers. There are organizations which help whistleblowers. The Courage Foundation is one example. There are others. We have self-help groups. I'm in touch with other whistleblowers, people like John Kiriakou, the CIA whistleblower, who blew the whistle on exactly the same subject I did, on torture and extraordinary rendition. John and I are in touch. But still, it's still a fight. Daniel Hale is in prison. Daniel Hale was a drone operator in Afghanistan for the American government. He was actually a civilian contractor who operated drones and killed people, with his drones. And he knew, or he learned, that 90% of the people killed by drones were not the intended targets. 9 out of every 10 people killed were entirely innocent bystanders. He blew the whistle on that. And Daniel is, as we speak now, Daniel is in high security prison in the United States. It's difficult. There are support networks. The best thing, but legislation doesn't help. The correct legislation would help, but legislation all the time, safeguards and legal protections for whistleblowers are being removed across the Western world. And one final thought on that. Barack Obama prosecuted more whistleblowers than every other United States president put together, which is an interesting point.
I think it's really important to say that out loud, also here in Slovenia, because there seem to be some fans among civil society of Obama. So yeah, let's remember that. Safe. Any other questions, maybe?
I would just have a question. You mentioned Jeremy Corbyn not being elected and the Democratic race being rigged. How do you keep faith in democracy or in democratic movements? Because it seems very, like, quickly we can, say that all the protests are somehow manipulated, paid for. Quickly we get to these conspiracy theories. And I'm wondering, where do you see, is there a clear red line that you see? Because, like, what's the system that controls it? Or you mentioned before the secret services. And doing the journalist's work, it's very difficult to somehow be critical about the system, but at the same time also try to show the tools that still work, fighting for greater democracy or truer democracy.
I think it is a blurred line rather than a clear line. I'm very pessimistic about democracy and about its ability to give people a genuine choice. A democracy isn't only a choice between two people. A democracy has to be a choice between two people where what happens afterwards doesn't just benefit the one that gets the salary, it actually changes what happens in policy. And that increasingly isn't happening in the Western world on any realistic or sensible level. The margin of difference between this right-wing opinion and this right-wing opinion, which is the choice you're given in an election, is so small that democracy has become rather unreal. And you have to, when you're talking about the media, you have to measure that also against the increasing concentration of media ownership, the fact that independently owned media is becoming a smaller and smaller section of the market, and various acquisitions and mergers have made the non-independent ownership of media more and more concentrated. And on top of that, media has changed enormously. 20 years ago, the British national newspapers based in London employed more than 100 foreign correspondents between them. That's journalists who lived in a foreign country, were employed by the newspaper and reported from that foreign country, and were supposed to develop an expertise in that country while they were there. Nowadays, that figure of more than 100 is 12. There are 12 foreign correspondents employed by British newspapers, between the British newspapers, to live abroad as full-time correspondents from foreign countries and report on what is happening in those foreign countries. Because maintaining foreign correspondence is expensive. It's much cheaper just to cut and paste it from the Press Association or Reuters, or to just publish what you get from the security services or the government and cut and paste that. That's much cheaper. And nowadays, newspaper proprietors care about what's cheap and how do you make more money and how do you cut your costs and reduce your number of expensive journalists. And having journalists researching stories and spending weeks and weeks hounding people, doing interviews, pounding the streets, researching before they produce an article, that costs money, with little end result as far as the proprietor is concerned. So the amount of money put in to the journalism function of newspapers has declined as a proportion of the cost, the overall cost of the newspaper, radically over the last 3 decades. At the same time, of course, perfect storm, you've got this big falling in newspaper readership. And bluntly, given the content of some of the newspapers, I'm quite happy nobody's reading them anymore. But it's very difficult to find for that reason, it's very easy. You know, the security services, as they do constantly in the UK, if someone from the security services goes up to a journalist and says, I've got a story for you, this Muslim guy who was arrested in Bradford, actually he's definitely now Kaiser guy, we know that because his brother was in Libya, blah, blah, blah. The journalists will say, oh, great, great, and just copy it down and publish it. They don't have time to check it. They don't have the resources to check it. You know, they put out the story the security services have just given them because it fills the newspaper and it looks good and possibly sells newspapers. But there's been a tremendous decline in journalistic ethics over the period of my lifetime. And when it's so easy for the government to get the propaganda story into the papers or into, and even easier onto your state media, if you're like the BBC and you're basically a state media, you can't be surprised when citizens stop believing what they see in the media. And that's what we're seeing. And actually, it's fascinating because now, of course, there's a tremendous kickback by the establishment where any non-approved story is a conspiracy theory. But in fact, they built it on themselves. And it's true. You know, there are many things from the alt-right or whatever, from Alex Jones and people, which are simple nonsense. You know, they're rubbish. But the failure of the media to provide honesty and to properly research and check out and call out governments when they lie is what has opened the gap for anyone to publish anything. Because the media are publishing rubbish. Why shouldn't anyone else publish rubbish? And then the public just have to swim through and try and find and grasp a pearl of truth there. But my advice to everybody is read my blog, because that's definitely the best place to find it.
So maybe just one question more we have been asking ourselves this throughout this conference. There seems to be indifference among the journalists regarding the Julian Assange case. Is this so also in UK and other countries? Is it just a general fact? And if it is, why is that? Because also for this event, except the journalists who already are very critical and are writing from different perspectives, I mean, nobody came to the event. Yeah.
I heard there's a big party for journalists today in Ljubljana where they can all get drunk instead. Which,
yeah, it's true, but you know.
That's always high on the agenda of journalists. I met one excellent journalist just before we...
except the ones that are present. I think there are
I think, no, there are some good journalists here. And there still exist very good journalists.
Yeah.
But
this lack of interest in Julian Assange, where does it come from?
It's tricky. Partly it's a feeling it could never happen to me. You know, Julian Assange is in such trouble because he published secrets of the American government. And many journalists understand that puts all journalists at danger. But if you publish any secrets of the American government, even if you've never been to America, you know, even though you're just a journalist and you didn't leak the secret, you could be subject to persecution. Intellectually, they understand that. On the other hand, they think, well, actually, I have no intention of publishing any secrets. You know, it's not going to happen to me. It's not what I do. And anyway, my proprietor wouldn't allow me to publish any secrets of the American government if I had them. So, although many journalists understand the principle that persecuting journalists under the American Espionage Act is a bad thing, and intellectually they understand that, they don't actually really feel personally threatened because they have no intention of doing any activist journalism themselves. So they think, okay, you know, this will only happen to troublemakers like Julian Assange. And I'm afraid, yeah, solidarity would be a wonderful thing, but if you expect it, you don't know many journalists. So I think that's a large part of it. People don't feel personally threatened because it's not their kind of journalism. But also, there's more to it than that, because Wikileaks is a threat to journalism, because it's an alternative model of journalism. It's not corporate journalism. It doesn't depend on corporate advertising like corporate journalism does. And it removes the filter. It gives people direct access to the source material. I gave you the example of the Panama Papers, where the corporate journalists only gave the examples of Russians and other, and people, and it wasn't only Russians, there were people from third world countries as well they highlighted, but they highlighted the declared enemies of the Western world. And they didn't highlight any of the US corporations or wealthy US politicians who had money in Panama, even though their details were in the Panama Papers. But that, it's not in the interest of the newspaper or whatever to highlight that. So that's a very different model to WikiLeaks' model of giving people the full-on information. It removed the power of corporate journalism to influence what you think by being the filter of what you see and what you don't see. And of course, nobody wants to have their power removed. So in a very real way, WikiLeaks is a threat to traditional corporate journalists. And a lot of corporate journalists don't like new media journalism, don't like citizen journalism, and don't like WikiLeaks. And I'm afraid that's a simple proof of it.
Maybe some more questions or comments?
I have one question to follow up on what you said. Maybe it can relate to your...
I thought you were wrapping up. Sorry.
Maybe it can lead on to your, I'm not sure if it's still ongoing, appeal in relating to your conviction. Are there any further avenues to pursue, or has this precedent that so-called citizen journalists are not held to the same standard as corporate journalists, is that now enshrined in European law?
No, I'm afraid it is enshrined in European law, but there are no more avenues we can pursue. And there's now a judgment from the European Court that says that it's fine for a court to imprison a citizen journalist in new media, and to say openly that they would not have a corporate media journalist in the same circumstances. But people working in new media are not journalists. In my case, they said specifically, a journalist is somebody employed by a media corporation. If you're not employed by a media corporation, you're not a journalist, and you don't have the protections of journalists. And the European Court has now accepted that. So that is now enshrined in European law. I mean, all we can do, and we can't affect that. That is now European law. All we can do, we can go to the UN Human Rights Commission to get a judgment from the UN Human Rights Commission that says that is wrong, and we will try and do that. But that doesn't affect the legal situation in Europe. European courts don't have to pay attention to that judgment of the UN Human Rights Commission. So I'm very sorry to say that is where the law has ended up. And the interesting thing is that contradicts and overturns many years of European Court decisions on exactly this point. And that again is to do with this extraordinary right-wing rolling back of society, I think, where the space for freedom is getting smaller and smaller, not larger and larger.
The Slovenian government is trying to protect legally whistleblowers. If you have an opinion on that.
I didn't hear it. Also, not sorry.
Yes, that right now Slovenian government is showing the will to protect whistleblower. So if you heard about that, and do you have an opinion about it?
Slovenian government.
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of the position of Slovenia, so
maybe the.
I certainly hope it's true, but I'm really not aware.
Okay, I think we are slowly coming to an end. Yeah, but I hope Craig and Marie will stay with us a little bit, or hope you're not too tired. And if you have any informal questions that you have for him, or want to do it in a more non-formal environment.
What she means is, if you want to buy me a drink, you're very welcome.
Yeah. Or a whiskey, right? Whiskey also. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming again. Hope that we can stay in touch, and maybe there will be we will start a campaign also in Slovenia for freeing Julian Assange. And also, just this, I know that you are now almost touring Germany because of the new documentary, Ithaca, that is basically telling the story through Julian Assange's eyes, and we have also contacted the production company, and hopefully we'll be able to see it in Maribor. But maybe can you just briefly speak about this, just briefly?
David, the film Ithaca, actually, it doesn't concentrate so much on what Julian did and the injustice against him. It concentrates more on following his family and the effect on his family of his imprisonment, which is terrible, true in his case, but also true of. I was put in jail for 4 months myself for journalism, and I discovered then that of the ordinary prison population, the vast majority of people should never be in jail. They're people who come from poverty, from educational deprivation, who've been in institutions their whole life, and for 90% of them, the root cause of their behavior is addiction. And prison does nothing to cure their addiction, and the criminalization of drugs and the crazy lack of intelligence behind the war on drugs, as it's called, puts all these people in jail. And so Ithaca is actually quite useful in a way, because yes, it touches on Julian and on the specific issues of his case, but you also see the horrible effects on people's families when they're put in jail. And for me, that's very evocative, because I left so many people behind in jail, most of whose basic crime is poverty. Their crime is they were born into very, very poor families, and it makes me think of the effect on all their families of them being in prison. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much again, and hope you will stay with us for a little while. But at 9:30, I think, around 9:30, we will enjoy the concert of Damir Audic, who I think is everyone is also, I think, hardly waiting for his concert. And if you want to receive information about what our organization is doing on a regular basis, there is a list of paper there when you can leave your emails, and we will inform you weekly. So thanks again, and thank you for coming today. Woo!